All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Smithsonian Social Studies Online. Today, our topic is what is the role of the United States in the world? I'm so excited for our host and our guest host conversation today. I think it's going to go in a really interesting direction. But before we get there, let's do some introductions and a few parameters for participation. So, I'm Abby Pfisterer. I'm an education specialist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and I'm here to help moderate some of your questions, which we encourage you to ask questions about the topic, about what Orlando and Becca will be talking about, and just in general about the Smithsonian, and to do so using the chat box to the right. So please ask questions throughout this session today. We'll be going for about a half an hour. And as you are participating, please remember to not include any sort of private information in the chat box. And if you're a teacher or a parent, please, we encourage you to participate fully with your student or your child. And we're looking forward to a really great conversation with all of you. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Orlando now to get us started.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, for being with us for the next few minutes. We're excited to have a fun conversation about the role of the United States in the world. And before we get going, I'd like to have our guest host, Becca, if you could please introduce yourself a little bit more. What is your role? Where do you work? What is your day like? How did you end up working with Smithsonian?
Yeah, so my name is Becca Lundgren. I'm an educator at the National Air and Space Museum, just down the road from the American History Museum, where both y'all are from. And I started working at the Smithsonian about 7.5 years ago. I went to school here in Washington, D.C., and I fell in love with museum education, working part-time at the Air and Space Museum as an explainer. And so I changed my career path, went to school for museum education, and I've been at the Smithsonian ever since, teaching things like aviation, space flight, and of course the history of science and technology, which is my passion and focus when I'm at the museum. And so I get to do a lot of fun things. I get to help run our observatory at the museum where we look at the sun safely through telescopes. I get to work with visitors on the floor from all over the world talking about different topics in aviation and spaceflight history. And I get to help design new exhibits, such as the new exhibits we're putting in for our transformation project. As if you've been on the National Mall or seen pictures online, and you can see them at our website, you'll notice that half the museum is actually closed right now, though of course the whole museum itself is closed currently. And that's because we're doing construction on that, on the whole museum. And so we'll be updating all our exhibits and doing a lot of fun stuff. So my days are always full of people and objects and stories and just a lot of fun things to do.
That's great. Well, and as Becca, thank you for sharing. As Abby mentioned, we're at the National Museum of American History. I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs there, just up the street from you, like you said. And we do want to allow folks to, if they have any questions about our topic before we get started, they could put them in the chat box, as Abby mentioned. But Becca, I want to ask you two questions before we really jump into some of the cultural resources you brought to share with us today. First of all, what do you miss most about being at the building, being at Air and Space? And second, the burning question on everybody's mind, do we still have access to the McDonald's, even though half of the building is closed?
Oh my gosh, great questions. I miss being at the museum so much. And one of the things that I miss so much is just being on the floor of the museum with people. Sometimes I don't even talk to people when I'm down on the floor. I'll go down from my office and I'll walk around and just kind of soak it all in, how many people are visiting from literally every corner of the world to see these amazing artifacts, to learn these amazing stories, and to just kind of engage in the air and space story in a really unique way. And so I just miss being on the floor so much, and I can't wait to get back to it, though I'm glad that I get to do things like this, even though I can't see all your lovely faces that are joining us, except for Abby and Orlando. And in terms of the McDonald's, there is a McDonald's 2 blocks away that you can go to. So our cafe is closed, but don't worry, you can get your McDonald's fix just a few blocks away.
Yeah, I mean, I know that was always, one of the highlights for my students when I took them down to the mall on field trips. Can we go to Air and Space? Can we also go to the McDonald's? I need my French fries. All right. Well, as we're going to get started, I want to remind folks of our question for today, which is, what is the role of the United States in the world? And here we are going to look at and think about and think through our first cultural resource. And as we do, Becca, can you please, sort of walk us through your thinking, how you conceptualize these group of resources as you were thinking about the question, what is the role of the U.S. in the world? And how does this portrait of Bessie Coleman fit into that?
Awesome. So this is such a great question. What is the role of the United States in the world? And I thought a lot about this in terms of all the resources we have at the museum, and all the stories that I can help interpret when I'm usually on the floor of the museum. And one of the things that came to mind is that aviation and space flight has changed the world in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad or neutral, but it has changed the way that we experience the world. And a lot of that development has happened through the United States, in the United States, or through U.S. involvement, whether it's through funding, whether it's through American scientists or engineers or pilots doing that work and leading that push. And that's for a lot of reasons as well. And so that aspect of it, the role of the United States as kind of a leader in the world, definitely plays a big role in the air and space story. But I wanted to think about who didn't have access necessarily, or who was pushed out of that leading role at first in terms of air and space kind of growing and expanding in the 20th century across the world. And so when I was looking at this question and thinking about it, I wanted to use it as a way to think about, okay, we have our actions we take in the world, and oftentimes it's discussed as leadership, and I want to think about what decisions are we making in our own country, and how does that kind of mirror or not the decisions we're making outside of our country? How does that match up? So this first resource that you see here, Bessie Coleman, it's actually a little pin back button. I don't know if do you have any like buttons you put on backpacks? Maybe?
I do. Well, I in true Generation X fashion, I have pins I put on my denim jacket because I need to let people know how I feel at all times.
Well, you are tapping into a legacy of pinback buttons that goes back for a really long time. Buttons have been used across time to denote what you believe in or political campaigns. I mean, I think pinback buttons were used back in the early 1900s for a lot of different reasons. And so this was a button with Bessie's picture that was actually from her pilot's license that you could wear. And that's in the collection of the African American History and Culture Museum here at the Smithsonian. And so it was something that you could wear to denote pride and things like that in a certain story or idea. And Bessie Coleman's story was one that people felt really strongly about and really proud about.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about, for folks who may not know who Bessie Coleman was, what is it about her story that is, definitely worth telling and thinking about when we talk about, the impact of aviation that, the U.S. led, or, during the early 1900s through, today, right? What was Bessie Coleman's story and why is she so important?
Absolutely. So Bessie Coleman is actually the very first woman of African American and Native American descent to be a licensed pilot. And that is really significant because this is a time when people from minoritized communities did not have access to getting to be licensed pilots and going to aviation schools, and kept out of that. And I know we can talk about that a little later on as well with some of the other resources. And so Bessie felt really strongly about this. I actually have a really great quote from her that I'd like to share with you from when she was interviewed by the Chicago Defender newspaper, which was a newspaper ran by her friend Robert Abbott in Chicago for the African American community. So in the newspaper article, she said, "Oh, well, because I knew we had no aviators, neither men nor women, and I knew the race needed to be represented along this racist important line. So I thought it was my duty to risk my life to learn aviating and to encourage flying among men and women of the race who were so far behind the white men in this special line. I made up my mind to try. I tried and was successful." I really love that quote, and honestly, everything that Bessie Coleman said was really inspiring, because she truly believed that by taking to the skies, not only was she following her passion and her dream, but that she could change her community's future. And so, yeah, I think her story is really inspiring.
That's wonderful. And can you let us and our viewers know when was Bessie Coleman alive? When was she doing all of this?
Absolutely. This is at the turn of the century, 20th century, when flight was just becoming a thing. I mean, the Wright brothers had the first successful flight in 1903, and that spiraled so many other people to want to join the aviation field, to build airplanes and to fly them. She actually had this kind of dream of flying in the late teens, 19 teens, but she tried to get into aviation schools, or to at least ask, like, could I do this in the United States? And she was denied. Most aviation schools, there wasn't any specific rule necessarily saying certain people couldn't participate, but because she was both a woman and a woman of color specifically, she was barred from participating. And so she decided that she needed to do something different. And with the advice from her friend, Robert Abbott, as well as kind of egging on from her brother, who had fought in France, and was telling her about kind of how France was much more open and there's all these pilots over there and you could fly, she actually learned French, saved money, and went all the way to France to get her pilot's license over there. And she did that in 1921. So then she came back to the United States and did so much cool stuff across the country. And the next resource, I can tell you a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Well, and if you don't mind, could I pause and interject a question we have from our chat here? I think it actually connects really closely to what you're talking about. So I'll put it up on the screen and I'll read it as well. But we've had a question that says, how did the First War, so I'm assuming that's the First World War, change the role of the U.S.? And you're talking about Bessie Coleman learning to fly right around the time of the World War and how flight was taking off, particularly in France. So Becca and Orlando, what are your thoughts on this question?
I mean, I can answer from the aviation perspective as well as the perspective of African Americans in France, because during World War I, of course, we saw an influx of new pilots that are joining the fight in France, and often fighting for France and not the United States, because they weren't allowed to. One of the great examples is Eugene Villard, who was the first African American pilot to fly in World War I. In France and for France, and so he did not fight for the United States Army Air Corps, but instead in France as well. And then after World War I, because of this influx of people who were part of the war, a lot of them stayed in France. And so there's this huge community that grew, especially around Paris and elsewhere, of particularly African Americans. And this is a little bit of complicated history here, because a lot of people might assume that that's because there was absolutely no racism in France and it was an amazing place to be. And that's not necessarily true. Racism is alive and well in a lot of places around the world today and then, and France was no different. But there was a different relationship with race there than there was in the United States. And a lot of people in France were interested in otherness and in Americanness. And so instead of there being disdain, there was a lot of fascination. And so that led to a more comfortable environment for a lot of people to stay, though still fraught, for sure.
Yeah, well, and I'll just add a little bit, because we want to get to some of these resources that Becca's sharing with us today. But what I would add on is that, up until this point, the United States had been this colony of Britain that was sort of on, another part of the world that didn't interact with Europe as much as it did during World War I. So in terms of how another way in which World War I changed the role of the United States in the world is that it made it, it was kind of a coming out party for the United States in terms of the kinds of resources that it had available, the kinds of intervention that it could, put in place around the world. And it, in many regards, internally for the United States, made folks aware of what it could do, what we could do, but it also made other folks around the world aware of what we could do. So it shifted the role of the United States to, a little bit higher, if we're thinking about a soccer table, right? Because I'm a soccer fan, the United States sort of moved up the table to maybe third or second place in terms of the top of the table and who was a leader in the world after World War One. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time, unfortunately, to watch this video, but I do want to let folks know that this learning lab that we are looking at right now will be available. We'll share the links with you all when we're done, and you can go back and watch this video. So if someone did watch this video, what are 2 facts that we could learn about, Bessie by watching this video?
Well, I love this video. It was produced by the Smithsonian a few years ago, and one of my favorite parts about it is just to kind of get to understand what it was like to fly during this time. Have you been on a plane before, Orlando, and flown? Yeah?
I have, and I'm not a big fan.
Yeah.
I fear that which I don't understand sometimes, and I don't understand how that thing stays up in the air, quite frankly. But I'm always fascinated by it. Yeah.
No, for sure. And so flying is sometimes something that's exhilarating. It can be really scary sometimes. Even seeing planes in the sky, even if you've never flown, it's like, how do they stay up there? Well, this is a time, even before the big jets that you see today, when we're working with planes that did not act like our planes today. These were much smaller. They were much more volatile and hard to control and things like that. And in this video, you can actually see footage of that kind of flying. Now, one thing that's actually important to note from this video is a lot of the footage that you're going to see is actually not Bessie Coleman flying. We don't have any footage that we found yet. And I say yet because you never know what's out there. Of Bessie flying, but we have a lot of still images that are interspersed. So it's a really good way to get a feeling for how she flew. And she flew in a fun way. She was a barnstormer. Barnstormers put on these grand shows. They were hanging off the edges of their airplanes, walking on wings, jumping from thing to thing up in the air. And Bessie was doing all of this herself for huge crowds across the country. And so it's just amazing to think about her bravery. She actually had the nickname Brave Bess across the country in different communities because of all of her barnstorming glory.
All right. So if any of you all out there have read Divergent, Bessie Coleman would have definitely been dauntless. She would have been one of those people who's out there in these streets doing all kinds of crazy things.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's see here. Moving on to our next cultural resource. Now, this would be a great tag for Mae Jemison to pick up her luggage at DCA, but I'm assuming this is not a luggage tag. What might this be, Becca? Can you tell us about this?
I wish I had an astronaut luggage tag.
Yeah.
So this is actually a name tag that's issued by NASA to astronauts. It has a Velcro back, so you can put it on the clothing you're wearing. In space especially, you have to have things attached to you physically, so Velcro is used often to attach different things, even to your person, but also to the sides of your spacecraft. So this was issued to Dr. Mae Jemison for her space flight, and then was added to our collection, and along with many other name tags as well. And actually, the reason I love to include Dr. Mae Jemison is because Dr. Mae Jemison was the very first woman of color to go to space. So when we're talking about Bessie Coleman back in 1921 being the first African-American woman and Native American woman to get a pilot's license, we then have Mae Jemison going to space. Now, can you guess when she might have gone to space? Guesses. It was in the 1900s. I will give you that.
All right. Well, it had to be post 1969. I'm gonna go with let's go 1990s.
1990s? That's a really good guess. Yep, it was in the 1990s, 1992. And so she went to space about 9 years after the very first American woman in space, Sally Ride. But this was 29 years after the very first woman, period, went to space, the Valentina Tereshkova from the USSR, and 71 years after Bessie Coleman got her pilot's license. And so I really like to talk about Dr. Mae Jemison in relation to Bessie Coleman, because these are barrier breakers who believed in what they were doing, not just for science and for aviation or for spaceflight, but for their communities. But it did take a long time for this to happen.
Okay, now this is an article in this learning lab that would lead us to more information about Dr. Jamison. And I see here that she was a founder and president of 2 medical tech companies. Do you have any idea of what those companies do? or her role?
Yeah, so Dr. Jemison has done so much before and after being an astronaut. Before she was an astronaut, she actually was a physician and part of the Peace Corps. And after she was an astronaut, she actually went on only one space flight and then resigned the next year, to the disappointment of her colleagues, but she had big dreams and she had a lot of stuff that she wanted to do. So she actually founded a research technology company, which was interested in kind of the sociocultural dynamics of science and technology and how it's developed. She was taught environmental studies at Dartmouth, and she actually also runs still and is a chair of the foundation, the Dorothy Jamison Foundation, named after Dorothy Jamison, her mom, that does a lot of different programs, from programs for students. She also helps with the nonprofit 100-Year Starship, which was originally a one-year study to figure out a business model for how interstellar travel could happen in the next 100 years. And it's kind of grown into this larger global project for that mission. So she just does a ton of different things still. And she's a really engaging speaker. So I definitely recommend looking her up and listening to some of her talks.
Okay. Thank you, Becca. Thank you very much. Now we want to pause here. We have about 10 minutes left with our time together. So if any of you all have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we will address them as they come in.
So we've actually got one here that came in earlier on, but I think it's a great question. So this question, and it is, do you think the U.S. role in the world should change each time a new president is elected, or should we aim for a more constant role regardless of leadership or administration? It's interesting. You're talking about two different moments in the past, in the 20th century, different leadership, different administration. So I'm wondering what you think about this question from a historical perspective.
So from an aviation and spaceflight perspective especially, the leadership of the United States does play a role in the decision-making that is happening, even if there are long-term goals for certain missions. We often think of, for example, NASA missions, like the Apollo mission to the moon, as something that was maybe inevitable or something that everybody agreed with, and that isn't necessarily the case. And there was a lot of competing factors in making those decisions along the way. And so back in the 1920s, when we're thinking about Bessie Coleman not being able to get a pilot's license, it's a very different political landscape than when Dr. Mae Jemison was going to space. But similar political considerations were taken into account, especially in terms of social politics and who was allowed and who was not allowed to be part of aviation and spaceflight.
Okay. Thank you, Becca. Thank you very much. Well, I want to make sure we have time for to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, which is our next cultural resource. So can you please tell us a little bit about their role, what they did, and why they're so important? I know that we might faintly know who they are, but if we could have some more details, that'd be great.
So this is actually great to bring up after that great question about how does political leadership change the way that our role in the world and how we interact with the world. The Tuskegee Airmen, it's named after this idea of the, quote, Tuskegee Experiment by the Army Air Corps to train Black people to fly and maintain combat aircraft during World War II. And so it was centered in Tuskegee, Alabama, around the Tuskegee Institute, which was an aviation institute. And so this resource that you see here is actually a commemoration, a congressional medal that was given to the Tuskegee Airmen. But the important thing to note is this medal was not given to the Tuskegee Airmen anywhere close to World War II. It was given in commemoration of them in 2007 by a very different administration. And this was for their unique military record that inspired revolutionary reform in the armed forces. And there's a lot of documentation from that ceremony of leadership, political leadership in our country, saying things like, we are giving this to you knowing all of the racial prejudice that you had to overcome as part of this. And we're hoping that this, at least in part, helps atone for that. And so it's really interesting, the decisions being made then by political leadership at different points. And this congressional medal is a really good example of it. But the Tuskegee Airmen, they actually served throughout about four years of the war, 4 or 5 years of the war, because they at first didn't have the training to be pilots and weren't allowed to be part of it. It wasn't until 1939 that Congress passed an appropriations bill that had money to specifically fund this Tuskegee experiment. And then it took a few years to get these pilots trained up and ready to fly. And so then they were able to join in 1941.
Now, Becca, I see. I mean, I heard you say that they only served about 4 years of the war. I'm assuming that was World War II, based on the dates, 1941 to 1949. Do we know how many total airmen served as part of, this experiment, this unit, this battalion?
Absolutely. Great question. So about 992 pilots were trained in Tuskegee, and about almost 350 of them or so were deployed overseas. Now, one thing that's really important to mention is that the Tuskegee Airmen aren't just the pilots, but the ground personnel. So we're talking about cooks and nurses. We're talking about aircraft mechanics. And there were about 16,000 total ground personnel as part of the Tuskegee Airmen or the Tuskegee Experiment. And so, yeah, I love that you're kind of pulling up this medal. We can see a pilot's kind of cap, and then
right
the helmet, the flight helmet. But look in the middle, we have a special cap for this kind of ground mechanic build cap to recognize all of the ground personnel. And when this Congressional Medal was awarded, there was actually 300 living Tuskegee Airmen in attendance. Only 6 of them were pilots. The rest of them were all part of this network of support for this part of the Army Air Corps.
That's great. Abby, as we transition here to our next resource, do we have any more questions that we can squeeze in here?
We do. Excellent. So we actually have 2 follow-up questions about the Mae Jemison resources. So these will be your rapid fire opportunity to answer because we are almost out of time. But the first is, how long was Mae Jemison in space?
Almost 8 days.
Awesome. And second is, how did Mae Jemison change the role of the U.S. in the world?
So Mae Jemison definitely has led in terms of changing the landscape for women of color, period, in relationship to spaceflight. She was the very first woman of color, just period, to go into space. And so she works globally with people around the world to think about how can we think about space in and the sociocultural context, and also help minoritized groups reach their dreams in terms of aviation and spaceflight. Great question. What was the name of the ship that Mae Jemison was on? And it was a space shuttle, though I am totally forgetting which one it was. So I will answer you later in the comments when I remember.
We know a lot of things. We don't know all the things.
Exactly.
Every once in a while, we forget. Well, Becca, where would we have found these posters that are very reminiscent of the, Uncle Sam posters of World War I? Seeing as how these highlighted a very particular, group of pilots and airmen, and like you're saying, cooks and whatnot, were these found predominantly in African American Black communities, or were they distributed along with all the other posters?
Great question. So these posters were actually across the United States as part of the war effort. They were designed to kind of instill a positive outlook, a sense of patriotism, confidence, and these were what we would term propaganda. Now, whenever we think of that term, often people get a little nervous because we hear about propaganda from the other side of engagement and how it can be bad, and you can look at propaganda in a lot of different ways. And so this type of propaganda was a way of involving everyday citizens on the ground in the United States in the war effort. And you'll see at the bottom, it says buy war bonds. And this was a way of financing the war for the US government. The war cost so much money. World War II, it's estimated cost over $300 billion. I think it's even more than that. And so being able to pay for this war was something that the United States was really interested in doing. And about $185 billion were raised with American citizens buying war bonds. Now, I think you asked, and it's such a good question, were these only in African American communities? So the government decided that every community was a great source for money and for patriotism and for involvement, which is a really interesting juxtaposition to how the U.S. government would either de facto or de jure treat these citizens elsewhere. And so when we are seeing these war bonds, everybody's money is welcome, but maybe not all those people are welcome in flying and things like that. So I think it's a really good resource to think about in relationship to all the other things that were going on in World War II. And so in this image particularly, I just wanted to note that this is Robert W. Dietz, who was an African-American Tuskegee Airman at the time.
Okay. All right, Becca. Well, the next few slides, the tiles that we're going to look at are some tools. I asked if we could move them quickly and be like, what are these things? What do they do? Because I don't know. So the first one we have is the slide rule. What is a slide rule used for?
Yeah, so all of us right now are on computers, right? And all of you who are commenting are probably on some form of a computer. It's something you put information into, and it works with that information and gives you responses back. Would you believe me if I told you this is a computer?
No, but I'm going to listen to you because you know what this is, and I have no idea. To me, it looks like a candy thermometer. I don't know exactly,
So this is actually an analog computer. Analog computer means it's not digital in any way. So it's something you move with your hands. And a slide rule can help you do a lot of things like multiplication, division, do exponents, roots, logarithms, trigonometry, things that a lot of people would do by hand. But this lets you do it a lot faster on the fly. And literally on the fly, because these instruments could be used before and after flight. And so this instrument, this slide rule, as well as the following instruments that you'll see, which is actually a circular slide rule, the same kind of instrument, and the pouch that it would have gone in, were all used by William J. Powell, who was an African-American aviator, as well as somebody who revolutionized African-American aviation in the 1920s and 30s, inspired by Bessie Coleman, actually. And he would have used these to teach students how to fly in the aviation schools that he opened up.
Okay. And as we, here's an article that, again, is available on this Learning Lab. So our folks joining us can learn a little bit more about William Powell and the work that he did. And as we start getting ready to part here, can you let us know, we answered some questions. I want to get to one more resource that we have here. Who were the Black Wings?
Yeah, so this book was actually published by the Smithsonian and as a reprint of the book that William J. Powell wrote when he was interested in inspiring people in his community to fly. I actually have a quick quote I wanted to share of his in relationship to him publishing Black Wings in 1934. And he wrote, "There's a better job and a better future in aviation for Negroes than in any other industry. And the reason is this. Aviation is just beginning its period of growth. And if we get into it now, while it is still uncrowded, we can grow as aviation grows." And so he was interested in inspiring youth, especially, to fill the air with what he called Black Wings. And so the Smithsonian has put on an exhibition at the museum, and that's actually the final resource is our online version of this exhibition that's been up for a few decades now, and will come back in a new form in our updated museum, all on these African-American pioneers in aviation and spaceflight history.
Wonderful. All right. Another wonderful article. Folks, I encourage you to go to these Learning Lab. We're going to show you the links here in a second. They will be also available in the comments there on the YouTube page. But as we head out, here is where the resources are found. They are there and available for you. You'll also see some Spanish language resources because at 12 o'clock, we will be doing a similar conversation, hosting a similar conversation on the same topic, just in Spanish, if you want to come back for that. And as we leave you all, could you let us know what these are right here? There are a couple of more Learning Lab collections. Could you let us know what these are about?
Just more exploring barrier breakers who kind of changed the way that people could engage with aviation and spaceflight through history, especially the stories of Bessie Coleman, Dr. Mae Jemison, William J. Powell, and others. Okay,
so what you're saying is this Learning Lab is like a rushing nesting doll of a learning lab. You go into one and there are more inside of them that we can get into.
Yep, excellent. You can go down a rabbit hole. Fill up the rest of your day.
All right. Well, Becca, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for joining us, for sharing such great resources about some stories that maybe we're not that familiar with. And one of the folks in the comments wanted to find out, was it the Endeavor? Do we know if it was the Endeavor that Dr. Jamison was on?
It might have been.
Okay. All right.
While Becca's looking it up. Okay.
It was. I just checked my notes. Awesome. No, thank you so much for having me. I mean, these stories are so amazing, and I definitely recommend looking into the online exhibition more and all these resources, and just listening to what these aviators and space and as astronauts had to say themselves, because they're the best tellers of their own stories.
All right, Abby, anything else for us before we head out?
Wanted to wrap up by again saying thank you to everyone for participating and for asking such fantastic questions. You can see the link there to find all of these resources that Becca and Orlando have gone through. And we hope you'll join us again by going to si.edu/distance learning. If you go to Smithsonian Distance Learning in the Google search, you can find it. You can find all of these links there to join us again. And thank you so much. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thanks.